All right, folks, I am ready to get started here. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the beginning of the fifth week together. We're pretty deep into this right now. I'm sure in some of your other classes, midterms are starting to sprout up. Your first midterm is in 2 weeks, so keep that in mind. There's still a little bit of time before the first midterm. We're going to cover taxes this week, the effect of taxes on the market via the market model we've been looking at. We'll kind of do an analysis of how markets can affect taxes can affect the market outcome, and sort of like how elasticities and consumer surplus can help us understand those effects. And then next week we'll do international trade. Basically, same kind of analysis. We're going to use the market model to sort of analyze the effects of like importing and exporting and how we can sort of gauge the effects on the efficiency via the concepts we've been studying. So there's a lot of like connective tissue in this first part of the course. Again, if you've been tracking the information as we've been moving along and kind of building up your knowledge, then it shouldn't be too bad like you kind of getting it all together and having it all ready for the first exam. Uh, so things are going smoothly as far as I'm concerned, and everything else seems to be going smooth as well. So let's keep going. What's up? No, I don't give out study guides. No, I don't. So you can check the practice exams. They're online. Like they give you an idea of how the exam is structured and how many exam questions are. This one later today. Yeah, but the Thursday is usually later at night or maybe on Fridays. But yeah, Tuesdays are. I come back to the campus and I can upload them today, so I do. Uh, what's going on? Any questions about anything you want me to address before I get going with the material? Sorry, I'm usually like more on point. I gave an exam this morning, and I usually lecture, and like the first lecture of the week kind of gets out of the way, and I'm ready for you guys when I get here. But my mind is not on this yet. It will be in a second, though. Don't worry. Anything you want me to address with respect to the class? Yeah, this class is pretty smooth going since we only have exams. There aren't other assignments, so a lot of it lands on you. Like beyond just like me covering the material for you, like it ultimately is in your hands to make this all work out in the best way possible. So I hope you've been working hard on your end. I hope you haven't been just kind of like relaxing and like just I'll do the homework and um, for those of you that aren't here, I'll just kind of casually listen to the lectures. Like I hope you've been taking it seriously because in the end, when the exam does come around, which is in 2 weeks, there will be a decent amount of stuff to cover. And if you're like, as I've said before, if you're learning things right before the exam, that's a mistake. Learn now as we go along. Learn the concepts, understand how you can apply them, understand how they might differ given different contexts. And then in the end, it all doesn't kind of blur together, which can dangerously happen. If you're just trying to cram all the information. So I'm always hoping that people are and people are like following what I say and like taking the right approach to a class like this. Because again, like classes like this, like they tend to have they're always curved. Like even when I took this class back at USC for the first time, like it was curved, and it was a very generous curve even then, because you're always going to have this huge spectrum of people that like I'm going to assume a lot of you are in like the top group where like you're very dedicated to what you're doing, you work really hard, you're actually listening to me, and you're learning the stuff as we're going along. So like when the exam comes up, it's like it's just like you study the way I've asked you to, and things work out really well. So like there's always a group of people where just everything works out great, smooth sailing for them. But then you always get people in the middle. They're always in the cusp of just like pushing themselves right to that point where like they truly realize and actualize like what they have inside of them, their potential, and like kind of get themselves to the next level. But then there's those people in that same middle group which kind of still haven't quite figured it out. And then there's always people at the bottom. And even though the seats that you see here that are empty, the people aren't showing up to class regularly. Some of them are working really hard. So there's people outside of our our weekly meetings that are working really hard, and I have a lot of respect for those people, as I have for you as well, because like again, like even though like they don't need me to guide them on a daily basis, like they are dedicated. But it's not too many of them. So don't worry, it's not like everybody that's not here is like some superstar. Those generally do tend to be a large part of the group of people that kind of wind up at the bottom. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because like, again, like this whole thing that you guys have signed up for, it's rigorous. It requires a lot of effort and a lot of time on your part and a lot of sacrifice and all this. But if you're doing that, it actually winds up not being that difficult. It's difficult in the sense that, yeah, you're giving up other things and like you don't have a lot of time to like do these other things you want to do. But as far as like the actual things you're expected to do, if you're dedicated to them at a high level, you're giving a lot of your time to them, they wind up not being that difficult. And part of like kind of building up that like confidence and like knowledge of how great you are, and sort of building the person you're going to become that will get out there and kind of take the world on and maybe conquer it in a good way. Part of that is just like working to kind of realize what you're capable of, and just proving yourself to yourself on a regular basis. So as long as I'm going to assume a lot of you guys are doing that, things are going to work out, and you shouldn't worry too much about anything, even when like exam times come up, where you have like a couple of midterms all kind of within 1 or 2 week period, maybe other assignments as well. Like it's not the time to like freak out. There's nothing to freak out about. If you're doing the right thing, if you're spending the right amount of time, that stuff will work out. Because that's another part of it, like the anxiety and the stress and all that. Like if you let that get to you, it will screw up your focus, even though you're dedicated and you're working really hard. So it all comes down to like how much you're putting into these kind of situations from the first day, and being consistent throughout. If you're doing that, then there's nothing to ever worry about. And again, that knowledge of knowing that there's nothing to worry about is the most valuable thing that you can cultivate here at the university, which will take you out into the world and allow you to face all the challenges that we face out here. And people will identify you as being of value, and they'll give you opportunities because they will see that you have it together, that you're able to handle most things. And again, that's the most valuable thing that you can cultivate here. So keep it up, folks. I'm seeing, like, I'm looking out in the class, and I'm seeing the same faces, and like that's telling me a lot about you guys. And before we even take an exam, and you show me what you're capable of as far as that whole thing, I'm seeing good characteristics from all of you, and that's a great thing. And again, to those people listening at home, it doesn't mean that you don't have that, but the people that are here, like you're demonstrating that, and that's great. It makes me feel good about what I'm doing up here. It makes me feel good that I'm not standing up here in front of an empty class, because I do make this optional for you to come to class, because I want to treat you guys like adults. Like you should be treated like adults, and only when you are treated like adults do you get to make the adult decisions, and then kind of start to become that terrific, wonderful, very capable person that is going to walk out of these doors in a few years and flourish, definitely flourish. All right, so let us jump into the material. So again, it's basically everything we've been doing and we're just kind of branching off in one direction or the other, but it's all very connected, and it's all centered on like the market model and sort of the kind of insights we can gain from it via the analysis we do with it. That again is in large part dependent on like our understanding of it, like the concepts that sort of help us to understand how well the market's doing and like how the participants of the market are behaving. So how well the market's doing, consumer producer surplus equals total surplus. How the participants are behaving, elasticity concepts, right? How sensitive are the participants of the market to changes in the market, to different prices, etc. So those are like the main characteristics of this model. So today we'll throw in taxes into it, and we'll do a sort of an overview of like the effect of the taxes on the equilibrium, and then we'll kind of branch out from that. And then on Thursday we'll cover just some of like the nuances of the tax system in general, and just kind of talk about different taxes, kind of give you a little bit more practical knowledge about you know, this very important part of our lives that we are all susceptible to, and we all kind of need to be okay with, because taxes are, you know, how the government runs, and if there's no government, there's chaos. That's the end of the story. So, so a lot of what the analysis is about via, you know, the market model and the stuff we'll bring up here is kind of like, well, ultimately, like, you know, what are the effects of taxes, and are those good or bad things? Well, the good or bad thing part will come down to, you know, the question of efficiency versus equity, how well a market is doing versus how fair it's doing. And again, the final determination of those questions is in your hands. Like, you decide what is best, given the information you have. And again, the tools we use are just meant to give us like what we call, again, like a sort of a positive analysis of a situation that's not meant to inject any kind of subjective ideas into it. And then you take that analysis, you take the conclusions of that, and then you figure out, well, how do you feel about it? You know, how would you apply it to maybe your own ideas and arguments about, you know, our tax system, whether it works or not, whether, you know, it needs to change or not. These are issues that you'll face throughout your life. You'll hear about them forever. It's just a constant in our society. So the more you understand it, the better. And definitely the more you understand how the world's affecting you, that's another way that you can cultivate like that confidence that you need getting out into the world. The more you understand everything that's happening around you, the better you feel about your place within it, and the less unsure you feel about life in general, which, you know, then helps to establish like a level head, which is so key to survival. All right, so before we jump into that, let's just quickly go over the stuff we covered last time. Elasticity. Again, the elasticity measure is a measure of how sensitive one variable is to changes in another variable. The main one we considered was the price elasticity of demand, the ratio of the percent change in quantity demanded to percent changes in price as we move along the demand curve. We established that the best way to calculate the elasticity is using the midpoint method. So you have a starting and an ending point for the price and the quantity, and then we plug it into this formula here, and we wind up with some number, which represents the price elasticity of demand. And then we said, well, what does that number mean? Well, demand could be very elastic or not elastic at all. The most it could possibly be inelastic, meaning that it's not sensitive at all to price changes, is for it to be perfectly inelastic. When the quantity demanded does not respond at all to changes in the price, that means the percent change in the quantity demanded is 0 over some percent change in price. And graphically, how that is captured is via a vertical demand curve that basically says that quantity demanded is not changed with respect to changes in price. So the quantity demanded is constant. You'll get that kind of situation with the type of goods that people desperately need and will pay for no matter what the price is. And then the opposite case is perfectly elastic demand. Perfectly elastic demand, you're going to get the horizontal demand curve. And in that case, demand is as sensitive as possible to price changes. So there's so much competition in the market that if the price changes by even a penny, quantity demanded will go down to zero because anybody else can sell the same product at a slightly lower price. And so people in these markets that are consumers are as sensitive as possible to changing prices. So those are the two extreme cases. And then you've got the middle cases where graphically the steeper the demand curve is, the more inelastic demand is. The flatter the demand curve, the more elastic demand curve is. At some point you get a demand curve that is exactly unit elastic. And so we define just in general how we can describe elasticity based on the magnitude of the number that we calculate. If the elasticity is between 0 and 1 in absolute value, the distance from the number line, then we say that we have inelastic demand. If the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1, we say we have elastic demand. And again, if the price elasticity of demand is exactly equal demand to 1, we say that we have unit elastic demand. And I established why this was an important elasticity when we talked about the relationship between elasticities and total revenue, which I'll quickly go over again. So total revenue, when we're talking about revenue, we're talking about the benefits to a firm of selling in a market, which is the amount of money they could earn, right? The price of what they're charging times the amount they sell, price times quantity is their revenue. And graphically, any point on the demand curve will correspond to a price quantity combination. And so as far as like what it looks like geometrically, total revenue, you take any point and you look at the quantity demanded at that point times the price, which will have a height of the price and a width of the quantity demanded. And so the rectangle that results from that graphically is the total revenue. When the price changes, there's two effects that occur. If, let's say, the price goes down, in this case, from 1,100 to 90, then, I'm sorry, $1.10 to 90 cents, then what's going to happen is that quantity demand is going to increase. We're going to move down along the demand curve because more people are going to buy the good at the lower price. And so that's going to result in two effects on revenues, like how much money the firms are making. If the price is going down, the goods that were already being sold, they are now going to be sold at a lower price. So this area C represents the revenue that's lost from lowering the price. It's what we call the price effect. So in this case, we're talking about a decrease, so it's the opposite of the case I have up here. And then as more people buy because 90 cents is lower, and so all these other people that had a willingness to buy that was below 110 are now willing to buy. So you've got, in this case, 200 more people willing to purchase the toll crossing, which is what this example was. Those 200 people now are buying the toll at 90 cents. So then this area here represents the extra revenue gain from those extra people entering the market, which is the quantity effect of a price decrease. And so in this case, when the price decreases, you have some money being lost from the price effect, but some money being generated from the quantity effect. And so the size of the price effect and the quantity effect will determine whether or not the total revenues are going to go up or down if, let's say, a price is going up or down. And so we summarize how that relationship works via this slide here, where we have up here a downward sloping demand curve, and then we've got down here the total revenue curve. So total revenue is a function of quantity. Up here, price is a function of quantity. We established that along the demand curve, so the steepness of the demand curve will tell us something about the elasticity in the market. But along the demand curve, you're also going to get differing elasticity. So when prices are high, generally you're going to have elastic demand. So this range of the demand curve is elastic. Then you're going to have some point where demand is unit elastic. and then you're going to have the rest of the range of demand where the prices are lower to correspond to an inelastic demand in general. So whenever prices are high, and let's say a firm wants to lower their price, that means they're going to increase the quantity demanded. Whenever prices are high, you're going to have elastic demand. When demand is elastic and a firm lowers their price, then that will increase total revenues. So in this case, the quantity effect outweighs the price effect. And then, of course, there's going to be a point where demand is unit elastic. That's going to be the point that corresponds to total revenues being at their maximum. And that corresponds to the point also where the quantity and the price effect exactly equal each other. And then beyond that point, when demand is inelastic, if the firm wants to lower the price, then they'll actually wind up lowering total revenues because the price effect will outweigh the quantity effect. As they lower the price, the revenue they lose from that, from lowering the price on the existing units being sold, will be greater than the extra revenue they gain from selling more units at the lower price, and therefore they'll actually lose more revenue than they'll gain, and therefore by lowering the price, they will decrease revenues over the inelastic range of demand. So this relation between elasticity and total revenue is super important. Make sure you understand it. Make sure you understand why it's different depending on whether elasticities are large, demand is elastic, small, demand is inelastic, and of course the point at which that relationship changes at the unit elastic point where total revenues are at their maximum. Factors that determine the price elasticity of demand, we talked about there's 5, whether a good is a necessity or a luxury. The more households need the goods, the less elastic demand will be, right? The less sensitive people will be to changes in price. If people really need something, they're going to buy them regardless of the price. But if something's like a luxury good that people buy when they have a lot of money, then they don't really need those things. And so those type of goods tend to have more elastic demand. If the price changes, people tend to be more responsive to those price changes. The availability of close substitutes. If there's a lot of different things that consumers can buy that are similar to what's being sold, then demand's going to be more elastic than if there's none, right? Let's say we're talking about a life-saving medicine that somebody has a patent on, and there aren't a lot of alternatives to it, then demand will be more inelastic. Share of income spent on the good. How much of a person's income is going to the thing that's being bought will determine how elastic demand is. If it's a huge part of your income, like your housing, you're going to be more responsive to changes in price than if it's a small part of your income, like salt, which is like a tiny part. Share, actually, there's only 4 of them here. The 5th one is more complicated and from my upper division course, so we'll just talk about these. Time elapsed since price change, so the more time people have to search out alternatives for their goods, the more elastic demand becomes. So demand tends to be more inelastic in the short run versus the long run. We talked about other elasticities, the cross-price elasticity of demand. How sensitive is quantity demanded to changes in price of a related good? Well, there's 2 types of related goods, right? Substitutes and complements. If the goods are substitutes like Coke and Pepsi, if the price of Coke goes up, the quantity demanded of Pepsi goes up, right? Because people substitute away from Coke to Pepsi when the price of Coke goes up. So the cross-price elasticity of demand tells us 2 things: whether this kind of demand, is elastic, it's very sensitive, unit elastic, right at that cusp between elasticity or inelasticity, or inelastic, not very sensitive at all. But the sign of this also tells us the relationship between the goods. If this is positive, then the goods are going to be substitutes, and if it's negative, the goods will be complements. Complements are sold together. If the price of peanut butter goes up, people buy less peanut butter and less jelly. So the percent change in quantity demanded of jelly, let's say, will go down as the price of peanut butter goes up. So this will be a negative number. So that's another thing you can get from the cross-price elasticity of demand. And of course, the magnitude, how big the number is, also gives you some information about how closely related the items are. The other elasticity we looked at was the income elasticity of demand. How sensitive is quantity demanded to changes in people's incomes? So if, let's say, we know there's 2 types of relationships between income and goods. that will define the nature of the goods. They're either normal goods or inferior goods. If incomes go up and people buy more of it, it's a normal good. If incomes go up, people buy less of it, it's an inferior good. So therefore, the sign of this will also give us some information about how the goods are related. If the change in income, if there's a percent change in income, let's say income goes up and the quantity demanded goes up as well, then we know it's a normal good. This will have a positive sign. Whereas if it's an inferior good, the percent change in quantity demanded will go down, and therefore the good will be an inferior good. So, and also the magnitude tells us how much folks consider it to be either an inferior or normal good. This is all information that you can get from like statistical analysis on markets. So this is not just like just random things that we're like having you understand in the abstract. And you know, it has like very practical applications, and it gives you a lot of insights into markets that firms are operating in, or insights into markets that you may be operating in at some point, whether as a consumer or a producer. And then finally, we looked at the price elasticity of supply, the percent change in quantity supplied with respect to percent change in price. So again, how sensitive are suppliers to changes in the price in the market? If the price goes up, do they respond by supplying a lot more, or do they not respond at all? So the price elasticity of supply tells us that information. And again, you can have two extreme cases where you have perfectly inelastic supply. Generally, that's going to be the case in a market where like the amount of the good that's being supplied is fixed. So here we're talking about like the radio spectrum that allows different cell phone frequencies to operate. Like when the government is selling those out to companies, they only have a certain amount to sell. They don't have any more than what's available, and so then the supply is going to be fixed. If you took macro, or if you take macro, when we look at the market for money supply, money demand, the money supply curve is also perfectly inelastic. It's vertical. It's determined by the central bank. So there's different examples of these perfectly inelastic supply that again represent markets where the good that's being supplied is not dependent on the price. It's just solely dependent on the fact that like the good is in short supply in general, and you can't really supply more of it. And then the other case is where you have perfectly elastic supply, where the market is as sensitive as possible to changes in price. Suppliers will either supply at a price. So this is the kind of situation where like anybody can get into these markets, and basically like there's like the inputs that you need to create whatever you're creating, like pizza. Anybody can set up a pizza parlor. It's not difficult. There aren't like patents on like special type of pizza ovens, things of that sort. Like if anybody has access to everything you need to supply in a market, then that market will tend to be more elastic, and the extreme case being perfectly elastic. And then we talked about the two main things that affect the price elasticity of supply, which is the availability of inputs. Again, with pizza, the inputs are really easy to get. With the radio spectrum case, not at all. You can't get what you need there. Like you need more like space and time, essentially, which is impossible to get. So the other thing is time. The more time suppliers have to respond to price changes, the more elastic their supply will become. So again, like you kind of have similar effects there. But ultimately, it's about understanding like what is elasticity in general, and kind of everything I went through right now is sort of the meat of what you should know with respect to these concepts. All right, before we move on, let's do a quick couple of quick practice problems just to kind of refresh your memory on a couple of things. Will either of these markets result in a shortage or surplus at a price of $60? So for art history for professors, will that one result in a shortage or a surplus at a price of $60? No, right? Because the market is equilibrating at $60, right? Quantity demanded equals quantity supplied at that point. What about this market over here? Yes. What is it? It's a shortage, right? Quantity demanded at $60 exceeds quantity supplied. So we wind up with a lot more demand than supply, so we will certainly wind up with a shortage there. In this case, 24 minus 8, so that's going to be 16 units. Will either of these markets result in a shortage or a surplus at a price of 90 bucks? Which one? So the art history professor's market will end up in a surplus, right? $90 is above the equilibrium price, so quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded there. What about over here? No, right? Because $90 is the market clearing price, right? It's the price at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. All right. Let's move on from that. Price elasticity of demand for iPods. Let's say the price of iPods starts out at $100. At this price, quantity demanded is 50. Let's say the price of iPods increases by $1, which is 1% of the original price. This $1 increase lowers the quantity demanded of iPods by 5, which is 10% of the original quantity demanded in absolute value. So the price elasticity of demand for iPods is, of course, the ratio of the percent change in quantity demanded over the percent change in the price of a good. In this case, we've got 10% change in quantity demanded over a 1% change in price. That means the price elasticity of demand is equal to 10. How do we describe that elasticity? We say demand is elastic, right? Because it's greater than 1 in absolute value. All right, suppose that during the past year, the price of a laptop computer fell from $2,200 to $1,900 per laptop. During the same period, consumer sales increased from 680,000 to 800,000 laptops. Calculate the elasticity of demand between these 2 points by following the steps shown next. After each step, select the appropriate answers in the table. Actually, I skipped that last part. We're just going to calculate the elasticity using the midpoint method, right? Right, so we're going to, remember, we are going to look at the change in quantity demanded, right, over the average of the starting and the ending point. So the original quantity of quantity demanded is 680,000. The new quantity is 80,000. We know the original price is 2,200. The new price is 1,900. We're going to calculate the average quantity by adding the original quantity and the new quantity, then divide by 2, and we'll do the same for the price. So average quantity, again, equals, we add these two together, and we divide by 2. Average price, add 2 together, divide by 2, get that average price there. And then we're going to calculate the change in quantity by subtracting the original quantity from the new quantity. Do the same for the change in price. So we got a change in quantity, which is in this case 1,200. The change in price is equal to negative 300. Calculate the percent change in quantity demanded by dividing the change in quantity by the average quantity. Do the same to calculate the percent change in price. So again, we're using the midpoint method. We're going to get the change in quantity divided by the average quantity over the change in price divided by the average price. So we've got percent change in quantity demanded equals 120,000 divided by 740,000, which equals 0.162. Multiply that by 100 to get 16.2%. Percent change in price, negative 300 over the average price, which is 2050, which equals negative 0.146 times 100, which equals negative 14.6%. And then just plugging them into our elasticity formula, we're just going to divide this percent change in quantity demanded by the percent change in the price, which is negative 14.6. And that's going to get us to, and this is the absolute value sign, just because I did leave in the negative there, so throw in the absolute value to make sure that we leave that out, because we don't need it when we're talking about the price elasticity of demand, because it's always going to be negative no matter what, so we don't need to throw that in there. So again, the ratio of our percent change in quantity demanded is 16.2 to the percent change in price, which is 14.6. So we got 1.11. That means demand is what? It's elastic, right? It's greater than 1. Even though it's greater than 1 by only 0.11, it is greater than 1. So we say demand is elastic. All right, so I just wanted to go through that one more time just to make sure that you guys know how to calculate elasticities, because sometimes people will leave this class not knowing how to calculate elasticities, and then you're expected to calculate them later, and you should know how to calculate them. So that's the last time I'll calculate the elasticity for you. The next time is when you will do it. and demonstrate to me you know what you're doing. So make sure you do know. All right, let's jump into this chapter and cover some of it today, and we'll finish it off on Thursday. So we're going to learn about the effects of taxes on supply and demand. We'll look at the costs and benefits of taxes and why taxes impose a cost that's greater than the tax revenue they raise. We'll look at the difference between what are called progressive and regressive taxes and the trade-off between tax equity, fairness, and tax efficiency. How well taxes are allowing markets to operate. And we'll just briefly look at the structure of the U.S. tax system. All right, economics of taxes, a preliminary view. So let's look at how the taxes affect our market model. All right, so an excise tax is a tax charge on each unit sold. It's generally going to be not percentage based like you see for most goods that you buy, but you're going to see it in like different types of goods. Like there's what's called a sin tax on cigarettes and alcohol. Those kind of taxes are like per unit taxes. They are excise taxes. So most tax revenue in the U.S. comes from other kinds of taxes, but excise taxes can be common. There are excise taxes on gasoline, cigarettes, foreign-made trucks, and many local governments impose excise taxes on services such as like hotel room rentals. So we'll look at the effect of the excise tax on the hotel room market. So the lessons we learned from examining excise taxes apply to other more complex taxes as well. All right, so let's look at the effect of an excise tax on quantities and prices. So here's your standard market model. It's in equilibrium. We assume that that's the starting point. There's no taxes yet in this system. There's a downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. They meet at the intersection where quantity demanded equals quantity supply, which corresponds to our equilibrium quantity of 10,000 and our equilibrium price of, in this case, $80. All right, so suppose that these are the supply and demand for hotel rooms in the city of Potterville. We assume that all hotel rooms are the same, so prices don't vary based on the hotel rooms. It's just to simplify the world that we're working in to understand the analysis. And again, all of this applies to the more complicated situations. All right, so suppose that Potterville's government imposes an excise tax of $40 per night on hotel rooms. So again, like there is an equilibrium price, it's $80, but now basically the government's saying that at any price that's being charged, there's going to be an extra $40 charge per room. So if a customer pays $80, $40 will be collected as a tax, leaving the hotel owner with only $40. So we know that the supply curve represents the willingness to supply given like the cost of individuals. And just the simplest case we considered was back when we covered producer surplus, when we talked about like individuals willing to sell their books, and there were only 5 folks, and each one was either willing to sell or not, whether given whether or not the price was meeting their costs, right? So we know that those that are willing to supply at the equilibrium price, their costs are being met. So all these folks down here, their costs are being met and more than that, right? They have producer surplus, right? The difference between the price and what they are, what their own cost is to produce. So then here we have exactly like the marginal, like that extra supplier that's willing to supply just because the price barely meets their marginal cost, their extra cost of producing, or in this case, supplying a hotel room. So if the government tells them that they now have to pay $40 per unit per room, then they will collect that $80, but they're actually only going to wind up netting $40, right? That $80 minus the $40 in taxes they pay. So therefore, their costs will no longer be met. So this supplier here will no longer be willing to supply because essentially they're not meeting their costs. So as a result, hotel owners are less willing to supply rooms at any given price. So whenever anything happens at any given price in a market, we know that that's going to cause a curve to shift, right? So at any given price, suppliers are not going to be willing to supply what they were supplying before. So to examine the question of what this implies about the supply curve for hotel rooms, we'll compare the incentives of hotel owners pre-tax and post-tax. All right, so pre-tax hotel owners are willing to supply, let's say at this point here, they're willing to supply at $60, they're willing to supply 5,000 rooms a night. So again, that means that they are this many hotel owners whose marginal cost, whose cost of supplying extra rooms is either at or below $60. After the $40 tax per room is levied, they are willing to supply the same amount, 5,000 rooms, only if they receive $100 per room, right? Before they were receiving $60, now they're going to have to give $40 of that $60 to the government, and they need to make up for that in order to then have their costs met so that they are willing to supply the same amount. So again, that 5,000 before they were willing to supply at 60,000, but now they have to add at $60. Now they have to add $40 to it to make up for that extra excise tax is being charged by the government. So again, $60 for themselves plus $40 paid to the city as tax. In order for hotel room owners to be willing to supply the same quantity post-tax as they would have pre-tax, they must receive an additional $40 per room, the amount of the tax. So this implies that the post-tax supply curve will shift up by the amount of the tax compared to the pre-tax supply curve. So what I just did for that one point happens at every single point. Every single supplier at every single point says, you know what, I'm only willing to supply now if I'm able to collect that extra $40 from the market, because if I can't, then my cost won't be met. So essentially, what the tax does is shift the supply curve to the left. How do we describe that in terms of like what's happening to supply? Is it increasing? Supply is decreasing. Yeah, supply is decreasing. Supply is shifting to the left. Also, you can say it's shifting up. So at the old equilibrium, at that price, obviously quantity supplied is going to be a lot smaller than quantity demanded. So then you're going to get a lot more folks along the demand curve that are willing to pay more. They're going to start bidding up the price. Then more suppliers will enter, and then it'll get us to this new equilibrium here. So we know that supply decreased. So what happened on the demand side? How do we describe what happened on the demand side? It did not increase. Yes, quantity demanded has decreased, right? Supply shifted to the left, and quantity demanded, because we just moved along the demand curve, quantity demanded decreased, right? It went from 10,000 to 5,000. All right, remember, you got to be able to describe these things. So you got to think about it as it's happening and then be able to describe it properly. Because again, you got to be able to say what is happening when a shift happens versus a movement along the supply curve. You need to be able to distinguish between the two. All right, so at this new equilibrium, then we've got that 5,000 being transacted, and the new equilibrium price will be $100. So at every quantity supplied, the supply price increases by $40. As a result of the tax, the market equilibrium moves from E to A. Although $100 is the demand price for 5,000 rooms, again, demand price meaning we look at the quantity and then we go up to the demand curve and think, and then figure out, well, what are people willing to pay for that quantity? That's what we mean by demand price. So at $100. So $100 is the demand price of 5,000 rooms. But remember, hotel owners only receive $60 because, again, they are giving up 40 of those dollars to the government for that tax. So from the point of view of hotel owners, they are actually still operating on their own old supply curve. But as far as what's happening to the market, we know, given our analysis, that the supply curve has essentially shifted and decreased to the point where we have actually now gotten to this new equilibrium where there are less rooms being transacted. All right, so the effect of an excise tax is similar to the concept of a quota. So remember, we covered the quota in the chapter before we covered elasticity. And that was one of the three cases of government interventions. One of them was a price ceiling. One of them was a price floor. The other was a quota. We examined the quota example via the taxi medallion, taxi license example, where there's only a certain amount of licenses available, so the quota was set up, let's say, at some point, and what that resulted in was a wedge between the demand price and the supply price. So the effect of an excise tax is similar to the result that we got from the quota, where you had this wedge. Again, the quota drives a wedge between the price paid by consumers and the price received by producers. The wedge was the difference between the demand price and the supply price, present in every case in which the supply of a good is legally restricted. That is, the price paid by buyers ends up being higher than that received by sellers. And we talked about how that difference between the two winds up being called the quota rent, where the quota rent is the earnings that accrue to the license holder from ownership of the right to sell the good. It's equal to the market price of the license when the licenses are traded. So remember, people were willing to pay more than the suppliers were willing to supply the good. And so the difference between the two was the price of the license to supply the good. So an excise tax also does create a wedge. So there's a wedge here between the demand price and the price that the supplier is going to be able to collect in the market. As a result of the wedge, consumers pay more and producers will receive less. So here was our old equilibrium. Again, it corresponded to a price of $80. The $40 excise tax per unit tax was imposed on the supplier that effectively decreased supply, shifted the supply curve to the left or up, however you want to describe it, got us to this new equilibrium over here. Suppliers were collecting $80. Now they're collecting $100, but they have to give up $40 of that, so they're actually going to wind up getting $60. Consumers were paying $80, but now they're going to actually wind up paying $100 for the room. So even though the supplier was the one being taxed, the tax itself actually wound up being split between the consumer and the supplier as far as like who's paying for what. Again, the supplier wound up taking a hit of $20, which is half the excise tax, and then the consumer wound up paying an extra $20, which is also half of the tax. So consumers end up paying $100 a night, $20 more than the pre-tax price of $80. At the same time, producers receive a net price of $60 per room, which is $20 less than the pre-tax price. In addition, the tax creates missed opportunities. So again, originally we were at this equilibrium in which 10,000 rooms were being transacted. The government imposed the excise tax. The supply curve shifted to the left or up, got us to this new equilibrium where now only 5,000 rooms are being transacted. So therefore, you've got this amount of transactions that are mutually beneficial that would have taken place in the market, but because of the tax, they were not able to. And as a result of that, we wind up with lost consumer and producer surplus, which we call what? Deadweight loss, exactly. We call it the deadweight loss. So there's a deadweight loss as a result of mutually beneficial transactions that could have occurred that did not occur. We have 5,000 potential consumers who would have rented hotel rooms, those willing to pay $80 but not $100 per night, and they are discouraged from doing so. So all these people over here, again, their willingness to pay is higher than the 80, but definitely below the 100. And so the price outweighs their own willingness to pay, and therefore they wind up not taking part in the market, whereas normally they would have. So it's important to recognize that the excise tax is a tax on producers, not consumers, and yet half of the tax is being paid by consumers. So that's one analysis that can give us that insight. And now we'll look at the opposite case and see what kind of effect that will have. What if the consumer was being taxed instead of the producer? So let's examine what would happen if the city levied the tax on consumers instead of producers. All right, so if a hotel guest must pay a $40 per night tax, then the price for a room paid by that guest must be reduced by $40 in order for the quantity of the same quantity of hotel rooms demanded post-tax to be the same as those demanded pre-tax, right? Remember, the demand curve represents the relationship between willingness to buy along the curve, which varies. All these people up here are willing to pay more than these people down here, right? Again, the difference between what they're willing to pay and what they actually have to pay is their consumer surplus, but the equilibrium price sometimes will be above those that are willing to pay a lower price, and therefore they don't take part in the market. So you just always have to remember these are not just lines, right? They mean something. There's like behavior that sort of is behind these lines. So like you got to kind of think about like what does all of this mean? It's not just like lines which are ultimately equations which lead to numbers, but those all of it has a lot of meaning, and you can do a lot of analysis with really simple frameworks, which then kind of gives you an idea of how far you can go if you complicate the model, which ultimately we do. And in practice, when you actually look at how all this stuff is being applied in the real world, it's more complicated. But even at the simplest level, you gain a lot of insight just by looking at the simplest cases. Okay, so again, these consumers over here, they were willing to demand 100 rooms at, 5,000 rooms at $100. But now when they pay that $100, they actually have to pay $140. So in order for them to be willing to, again, consume 5,000 rooms, then the price has to be reduced by $40 in order for them to, maintain that level of demand. So that happens at every single point. So the demand curve essentially winds up shifting down from our original point to this one here. The distance between the old one and the new one is $40. So at every old point, they essentially need the price to be reduced by $40 in order to remain that same quantity, in order to have the same quantity demanded by the market. So effectively, the tax shifts the supply curve down. The demand curve down. How do we describe that? What do we say in terms of what's happening to demand? I think I heard it. Demand decrease, right? Demand shifted to the left or down, which means demand decrease. What happened to on the supply side here? The curve stayed the same, but what happened along the curve? In what way? Quantity supply decrease. Very good, yeah. So demand decrease, which caused quantity supply to decrease, right? Because we moved along the supply curve as a result of the demand curve shifting, which at the old equilibrium resulted in a surplus, right? At that old equilibrium price, before the tax was imposed, when the tax was imposed and the demand curve shifted and demand decreased, then at that old equilibrium price, you're going to have the old quantity supplied, but then you're going to have at that price a quantity demanded, which is much less. So you're going to have a surplus, which means all these sellers will start lowering their price, and then these folks will enter the market, and then they'll get us down to that equilibrium. But as a result of the demand curve shifting and demand decreasing, quantity supplied responds by decreasing. Quantity supply decrease. So make sure that you get that. Make sure you understand that and you're able to describe it. Both sides of the effects of a change on the market. All right, so again, we're looking at the opposite case, in this case of the excise tax being placed on the consumers versus the producers. We saw that when the excise tax, the tax per unit, the tax per room was placed on the consumer, that the supply curve shifted to the left, supply decreased. When the excise tax is placed on the consumer and they have to pay an extra $40 per room, then demand will decrease, and that's what we have here. So that shifts our equilibrium from E to B, again, corresponding to the point where 5,000 rooms are being transacted. And the price that is clearing the market clearing price, the equilibrium price, is $60. But remember, the consumers have to pay $40 extra for that amount of hotel rooms, and therefore they do wind up paying $100. So even though they are paying $60, that's what the suppliers are going to collect, but consumers are going to wind up paying that $100. So essentially, the consumers are still on their old demand curve, but as far as like what's happening in the market, the demand curve has shifted. So from the point of view of guests, it's as if they were on their original demand curve, but actually at point A. So in this situation, when the consumer is being taxed, you're going to have a similar effect as far as like how both sides are being impacted relative to what they were either collecting or paying at the old equilibrium. At the old equilibrium, $80 was being paid for the rooms. When the excise tax was placed on consumers, it effectively got us to this new equilibrium, and the producers are now going to collect $60, which is $20 less than they were collecting. And consumers are going to pay $100, which is $20 more than they were paying. So as you can see, given the same very simplifying conditions that allow us to do this kind of analysis, that no matter who is taxed, whether it be on the supplier side or the consumer side, the tax will be split up between the two groups. In this case, evenly, 2020. Is there a question back here? So again, we can compare them here. Tax on supplier, supply curve shifted up. And again, the price was 80. Suppliers are now collecting 100, but they're paying 40. So they're getting 60, which is the same as over here. Consumers are paying them 60 for the room. So that, again, $20 less than what they were getting, regardless of whether they were taxed. And again, consumers, they were paying 80 when supply was being taxed. Now they wound up paying 100, and so that's $20 more than they were paying. Over here, because they were taxed, that effectively decreased demand, got us to the new equilibrium. They're paying 60 to supplier, but they do have to pay that $40 in tax, which gets them to 100, which is $20 more than what they were paying. So $20 more what they were paying is the same regardless of who got taxed. So in both cases, consumers pay $100, producers receive $60, and 5,000 hotel rooms are bought and sold. So it doesn't matter who officially pays the tax, the outcome is the same. What we say is that the incidence of the tax is going to be, in this simplifying case, equally split. So the incidence of the tax is who really bears the burden of the tax. So the analysis illustrates the general principle of the economics of taxation. The incidence of a tax is typically not a question you can answer by asking who writes the check to the government. Because ultimately, as you can see, that the incidence of the tax, regardless of who gets taxed, will affect all market participants. Are there any questions about this? All right, so that was like the simplest case possible, which allowed us to identify the sort of the nature of the incidence of a tax. Via a very simple example where both sides wind up paying equal shares regardless of who's being taxed. But in reality, that's not the case. You're never going to have those perfect circumstances. And so what's going to affect the incidence of a tax is going to be the elasticity of the market. How elastic is demand? How elastic is supply? We know that's going to affect the steepness of the curves graphically. And so that will lead to differing distributions of the incidence of the tax. So let's talk about price elasticities and tax incidence. So the 50-50 split between consumers and producers in the previous example is a result of the assumptions in the example. In the real world, the incidence of an excise tax usually falls unevenly between consumers and producers, as one group bears more of the burden than the other. The incidence of an excise tax depends on the price elasticity of supply and the price elasticity of demand. All right, So now you know why I wanted to go through everything we did last time, because I wanted to remind you about all the elasticity concepts so you can kind of merge it all together. We're going to throw in some consumer and producer surplus analysis as well. Maybe not today, but I think maybe on Thursday. But as you see, it's like as we develop new tools, we use them to analyze things, and it's all going to peak in the next chapter when we look at international trade. So we're going to be looking at everything once again, using everything that we've been looking at so far to analyze that situation. All right, so here's a situation where you've got a pretty steep demand curve. So what does that say about demand in this market? Say that one more time. Inelastic, right? The steeper it is, the more inelastic it is, the more non-responsive to changes in price, quantity demand it is, right? People are less sensitive to changes in price, right? The most extreme case being perfectly inelastic. Inelastic starts with an I. Vertical line kind of looks like an I, so that's kind of like a good way to kind of situate yourself as far as what means what. All right, so we have pretty inelastic demand here. What about supply? Pretty elastic, right? The flatter supply is, the more elastic supply will be. So again, these are the extreme cases where you have the inelastic supply and demand being vertical, and the perfectly elastic demand and supply being horizontal lines. So again, this one's closer to elastic supply, and this is closer to inelastic supply. All right, so in the absence of a tax, gasoline here would of course go for $2. That's our market clearing price. That's the price at which quantity demanded equals quantity supply, where the market is in equilibrium. So we've learned that an excise tax drives a wedge equal to the size of the tax between the price paid by the consumer and the price received by the producer. So in this case, we're assuming that there is an excise tax of $1 per gallon. So whenever you have a situation where demand is very elastic, demand is very inelastic, we know that people are not very sensitive to price changes, whereas on the demand side, whereas where you have a very elastic supply, suppliers are very responsive to price changes. We know that adding a tax changes prices. And so therefore, if you have one side of the market that's less sensitive to price changes, then obviously it makes sense for that side of the market to take on a bigger burden of the tax, right? For the incidence of the tax to be greater on that side of the market, the more sensitive, the more elastic side of the market versus the more inelastic, right? So in this case, we have more inelastic demand, and therefore the tax burden will fall mainly on consumers. So again, in this case, we're assuming that the tax has already been imposed, and it's an excise tax of $1. So the excise tax has been imposed, but we're not seeing the new equilibrium. In fact, we don't even know which side is being taxed, because it doesn't matter, because we know that no matter what, the incidence will be distributed amongst the two. So in this case, when the excise tax is $1 per gallon, it's going to raise the price for consumers to $2.95, whereas before they were paying $2. So they're going to pay 95 cents of that excise tax versus the suppliers, which will only wind up paying 5 cents of the excise tax. So again, it doesn't matter who's being taxed here. What matters is that the incidence of the tax winds up falling greater on the demand side because it is more inelastic than the supply side. Demand is less responsive to changes in price. So the example illustrates another general principle. When the price elasticity of demand is low and the price elasticity of supply is high, then the burden of an excise tax falls mainly on consumers. So I would expect you to understand this relationship and be able to identify it graphically, maybe even reproduce it graphically. All right, second case. An excise tax, in this case, is going to be paid mainly by producers. So in this case, we have fairly flat demand curve, right? Which means that demand is what? Demand is elastic, right? It's pretty flat. We can ascertain that it's pretty elastic, pretty sensitive to price changes because of that. What about supply? Inelastic, right? Pretty steep. Again, there's our benchmark cases to sort of bookmark. Kind of bookend the possible spectrum of elasticity. All right. So in this example, because the supply side is more inelastic, less sensitive to changes in price, if we impose now a tax, so here there's going to be a $5 per tax on downtown parking in a city. That's our old equilibrium there. So now what's going to happen is that consumers are going to wind up paying $6.50, and because they have more elastic demand, super sensitivity to price changes, the incidence of the tax is not that large on the consumers. And so for them, they only wind up paying 50 cents more than they were paying before. Whereas for the city itself, the supplier of the parking spaces is very inelastic, which makes sense because parking spaces are, there aren't so many. Like, it's a fixed amount, so you're going to have a more sort of inelastic supply in that kind of setting. So they were collecting $6, and now they're going to wind up collecting $1.50. So they're going to wind up paying, in this case, $4.50 of the tax, and 50 cents is only going to be imposed on the consumer. So the incidence of the tax will be much larger on the supply side because supply is more inelastic. So in the absence of a tax, the market equilibrium is $6 per day, as we know. Tax burden falls mainly on producers. The example illustrates the general principle. When the price elasticity of demand is high and the price elasticity of supply is low, the burden of an excise tax falls mainly on producers. Any questions about any of this? Those of you that are paying attention, it seems like you're getting it, and I appreciate that. I like that a lot. Yeah. To get more. So as a result of the tax, like, the transactions were limited to this amount. So the supply definitely went down quite a bit as a result of that. Is that what you were wondering? Yeah. So again, we're not talking about who's being taxed here, and so therefore we're not looking at the curve shifting. We're just talking about, like, the incidence of it. And so the tax got us to this new point now. Regardless of who's paying for it, there's this many parking spaces that are being bought and sold in the city now versus this many that were being bought and sold before. So there's definitely some deadweight loss there. So elasticity, not who officially pays the tax, determines the incidence of an excise tax is ultimately the point of all this. Yeah. So the deadweight loss would be the area of this triangle here. So before, that was the price that was clearing the market. Now, one of these curves shifted depending on who was given the excise tax. So because of that, now we have consumers that are paying $6.50, and there are suppliers that are collecting $1.50. So therefore, you've got these supplier, like this much producer surplus that's gone, and then this much consumer surplus that's gone. So if you get the area of that triangle, you can figure out the deadweight loss. All right, folks, we are done. Wait, it was a question. Yeah, what's the question? Right, because lower elasticity means they're less sensitive to price changes. So if the price changes, it makes sense that they would wind up taking on the bigger burden of the tax because they're less likely to respond to that. All right, folks. So that's the first part of the taxes lecture. We'll finish it off on Thursday, and that'll be that. So have a good couple of days. I'll see you on Thursday.